Hello, good afternoon. I don't know why my camera is not working at the moment, but that's okay. You don't need to see me. So we will be going through lecture 11 today. It is quite straightforward and it shouldn't take us too long. Okay, I'm just going to go through some of the core concepts with you, and making sure you have a good understanding of them. Okay, so let's get started. Before we go into the actual reproductive system material, it's good to refresh our understanding of the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. All right, so if you recall, if this is your head, for example, your pituitary gland and hypothalamus is somewhere right here. Okay, and last time we talked about how the pituitary gland actually sits within a little groove that is found in at the top of the sphenoid bone, right? And so if I take this out and then we're going to redraw a bigger diagram, then we will have something that looks like this. All right. So over here, we have the hypothalamus. And then down here, connected to the hypothalamus, would be the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland has two parts. Okay, there is the anterior pituitary gland. Now, it's not necessarily the one that is on the left side on the diagram. Okay, it depends which side your head is looking at, right? So the anterior pituitary gland is the one that is typically bigger in size. And over here, we have the posterior pituitary gland. Okay. Now, there are two groups of neurons that are found in the hypothalamus. Okay, some of them will have their axons extend all the way to the posterior pituitary gland, like this. Okay, and for these group of neurons, okay, hormones are made in the hypothalamus. But are stored and released from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay. So there are two such hormones that fit this description. One of them we already learned, right? It is the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, which helps you conserve water. Okay, we learned that from the urinary system. And you make the ADH in the hypothalamus, and it will be transported into the posterior pituitary gland when your blood osmolarity goes up. Right? So when you're dehydrated, the blood osmolarity, the blood concentration goes up. It will cause the cells in the hypothalamus to shrink. That in turn sends a signal down the axon and cause the ADH to be released from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so that's ADH. There is another hormone that does this. Does anybody know what it is? Maybe it was mentioned in the lecture. I don't remember if I talked about it yet, but just want to throw it out there and see if anybody know what the other one might be. I'll give you a hint. It's important for female for giving birth and for breastfeeding.
Oxytocin?
Oxytocin, that's correct. Thank you. So that's oxytocin. If you are a mother, you might remember during labor, the doctor might have given you some of the artificial oxytocin to induce the labor, right? To cause the contraction to occur, right? So your body naturally makes that. In the hypothalamus, it would then again be transported and stored in the posterior pituitary gland, and then it will be released when the right trigger is there. Okay, so that's one group of neurons. They're physically connecting the hypothalamus with the posterior pituitary gland. The other group of neuron that I'm going to draw here, they don't extend all the way to the anterior pituitary gland. They just kind of stop at the boundary, if you would. Okay, so these neurons, they would secrete. Here, I'll write here. So these group of neurons, they would secrete. They would secrete two types of hormone. Two types of hormones to regulate the anterior pituitary gland. Okay. So one group of hormone is called the releasing hormone. And the other group is called inhibiting hormone. And that should be self-explanatory. When a releasing hormone is released from these neurons, it will allow the anterior pituitary gland to release another hormone. If the neuron release an inhibiting hormone, it will prevent the anterior pituitary gland to release a hormone. Okay, so basically whether or not the anterior pituitary gland can release a hormone depends on whether the hypothalamus is releasing a releasing hormone, right, like a green light, or an inhibiting hormone. Okay, so anterior pituitary gland, the AP hormones are controlled by releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. So in the context of what we are talking about for the reproductive system, there are two hormones here that are involved. There is the FSH, and then there is LH. Okay, so FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and then LH stands for luteinizing hormone. Okay, so in order for the anterior pituitary gland to release the FSH or LH, they must have a trigger from the hypothalamus, and that trigger comes in the form of GnRH. Okay, so GnRH is gonadotropin. Releasing hormone. Okay, and again, the function is to allow the anterior pituitary gland to release the follicle stimulating hormone as well as the luteinizing hormone. Okay. Now there are other hormones which you will learn next week, but for now, those are the ones that we have to focus on. Is that okay? Does anybody have any question for me so far? All right, so we're going to talk about the hormonal regulation in the female reproductive system first. Yeah, that's the one that's a little bit more complicated. The men one is relatively easy to understand, but let's do the woman first. Okay, so let's draw some of the structure here. So that's the ovary, and the ovary is going to be connected to to the uterus through a tube. Okay. And of course, it's symmetrical. It's on both sides. Okay. So that's ovary. What's this thing called? This structure over here that connects the ovary to that?
Follicle tube.
Yeah, very good. Nor and Tina, the fallopian tube. Okay. So that's where the egg is going to come out, and you know, if the sperm is there, it will fertilize the egg and results in a pregnancy, right? Okay, so fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube. Okay, so then over here we have the uterus. That's where the baby will grow. Okay. The lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. Okay. Endometrium. That is the lining of the uterus. And the thickness of the endometrium is going to change in the presence of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, we're going to come back to that later on. All right, so let me just write a few more things here. Fallopian tube, that's the location of fertilization. Right, we don't want fertilization to happen elsewhere because it might end up implanting the embryo somewhere else other than the uterus, and that's very dangerous for the woman. It could result in what's called an ectopic pregnancy. That's when the implantation occurs elsewhere other than the uterus, and it's an emergency that requires treatment. Otherwise, it could irreversibly damage the reproductive system. Okay, so that's that. So now we're gonna take the ovary and we are going to take a look at what's happening inside the ovary. All right. So here is the ovary. That's bigger, zoomed in. So in the ovaries, both of them, but I'm just gonna draw one of them. There is going to be a follicle. In fact, there are many follicles. You learned last semester that women are born with all the eggs that they're gonna have in their entire life, right? Because the meiosis process actually happens when the girl is still a fetus, right? And then the meiosis suspend in prophase 1, and then it will continue when the girl reach the puberty. So in the ovary, there will be these eggs, okay, that are suspended. So that's the follicle, we call it a follicle. Okay? And for simplicity's sake, we'll say this will mature into an egg. Okay. So the follicle will grow under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone. We'll come back to that later. It will grow, okay, and then it will be ready in the end. Okay, so this happens during the first half of the menstrual cycle. Okay, and this phase where the follicle is growing is called the follicular phase. Follicular phase. And what we want to remember is that as the follicle is developing, it will be secreting a hormone. Okay, it will be pumping out hormone. Does anybody know what hormone I'm talking about? Yep, estrogen is correct. And some older textbook, they spell it with a O at the front, just like Mavis typed there. That is also correct, but I'm just gonna go with the one with the E, okay? Estrogen. So let's write a quick note here to see. Okay, estrogen is released as the follicle develops. Okay. So in a typical cycle, right? In a typical 28-day cycle. So 28-day cycle. It's not 28 for everybody. I'm sure many of you know that. Like it could be longer, could be shorter, but most textbooks say 28-day cycle. The follicular phase would be from day 1, marked by the menses, to 14-day. Okay, 1 to 14-day. Okay, so midway in the cycle, the egg is ready and the egg will be ovulated. Okay, so this is ovulation. Ovulation. Occurs right in the middle of the cycle. And of course, the egg goes into the fallopian tube, right? That's what this thing is. And what happens is you will have some leftover materials from the ovulation. The egg is released into the fallopian tube, and then we will have some leftover stuff. This leftover tissue is called the corpus luteum. Okay, so this is the leftover tissue after ovulation takes place. Okay. Now this corpus luteum will grow a little bit, it will get bigger. Okay. But then after a while, it would just start to break down again. Okay. So this second half of the cycle, that is marked by the presence of the corpus luteum, we call this the luteal phase. Luteal phase, which would be 14 to 28 days. Now, as the follicle, as the corpus luteum is growing and then eventually shrinking, it's going to pump out another hormone. Okay, and this hormone is anyone remember what the second one is? Yep, that would be the progesterone. Okay, so I'm just gonna put it on the side here. Progesterone is released by the corpus luteum. Okay, now the corpus luteum is not a permanent structure; it's a transient structure. It's just going to be there for like 14 days, and then it will break down. So that kind of sets the stage of what we're going to talk about. Are we together? Anybody need like any clarification before we move on? Okay. Now I'm gonna go back to our study guide here. I'm just gonna grab this picture, and we are going to talk about what happens in the picture. There we go. So this is the hypothalamus. This is the anterior pituitary gland. And the red thing here is actually capillary network. It's kind of like what we talked about in the kidney. It's like capillary, blood vessel, capillary, very close to each other, right? These kind of system where you have two networks of capillary very close to each other, connected by a short blood vessel, we call them portal system. Right? So we have a portal system in the brain here. We have it in the kidney. We also have them in the liver. And the portal system allows distribution of hormone quickly from one location to the next in this particular case. So the hypothalamus will secrete the GnRH, which would go into the capillary right here, and then it would exit from this capillary network here. And that's the permission to allow the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH. Okay, so that's what we're going to write. We're going to write down what's happening here. And we're going to talk more about it as we write them. So number one, this step here, right? So the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's a permission that allows the anterior pituitary gland to secrete a hormone. So it secretes GnRH, which stimulate the AP, the anterior pituitary gland. Let's just write it out. To release FSH and LH. Okay, so it's both, but in this beginning phase, in the follicular phase, the dominant hormone is the FSH. Okay, so again, I keep on telling you what it stands for, but I never wrote it down. It's the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, and this other guy, that's the luteinizing hormone. Okay, memorizing the name will help you remember what they do. Okay, so that's step one. Then the follicle stimulating hormone will travel through the bloodstream all the way to the ovaries. And as the name implies, the function of the FSH is to stimulate the follicle. Okay, so FSH travels to the ovaries through the bloodstream. And stimulate a follicle to develop. Okay. Now there is some communication between the two ovaries. If there's follicle developing in one ovary already, then it will prevent a follicle from developing in the other ovary. Okay, so that's number two. And number three, what's happening? Well, number three, we can see here, as the follicle develops, it's going to be pumping out estrogen, right? Which is what I told you just one, like over here, right? In the diagram above. Right? So that's what we're going to write. As the follicle develops, estrogen is released. Estrogen has two effects. Okay. Number one, it will have positive feedback on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland. A positive feedback is something that will exaggerate the original event. So let me give you an example of negative feedback first. Okay, negative feedback is the more common mechanism in the body. So negative feedback is like a thermostat. Okay, we want to maintain 37 degrees body temperature. When it gets too hot, there would be negative feedback mechanism that would turn the temperature back down. You will sweat, for example, right? That helps you cool off. Okay. When it's too cold, then your body will have mechanism that will bring the temperature back up, like shivering. Okay, so that's negative feedback because the original trigger will cause the opposite effect to occur. We already learned several other examples of this happening with things like aldosterone. Okay, when the blood pressure goes down, aldosterone will bring it back up, right? So it's the trigger and the final result is opposite to each other. If you have too much calcium in the blood, calcitonin will bring it back down. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about the positive feedback, which is opposite. So over here, we have GnRH, which ultimately leads to the release of estrogen. In a positive feedback manner, estrogen will cause you to release even more GnRH. Okay, so if I put it in a very simple sense, increase GnRH will lead to increase in FSH and LH, which would lead to increase in estrogen. Okay, but then the estrogen would go back in a positive feedback to cause more GnRH to be released as opposed to lower the GnRH. So that's called positive feedback. Another example of positive feedback would be childbirth. Okay, the person has a little bit of contraction that causes your brain to release oxytocin. The oxytocin will cause even more contraction, and then that causes more oxytocin to be released, and then more contraction and more contraction. So it exaggerates the initial trigger, right, until the baby is pushed out, right? Okay. One last example would be like blood clotting. If you have a cut, you start forming a little bit of a scab, right? Some platelet comes, and then that would lead to more and more platelets coming, right, until the wound is sealed, right? So it exaggerates the initial trigger. That's what a positive feedback is. Okay, so estrogen will go back to the hypothalamus, go back to the AP, and cause more of these things, the GnRH and the FSH, to be released. Okay, so that's the first effect. The second effect is that the estrogen will cause the endometrium to thicken. Thickens the endometrium. By stimulating blood vessels to form. Okay. So that is that so far. And everything here is part of the luteal phase. Sorry, a part of the follicular phase. Okay, so that's step number 3. So we're gonna go and talk about step number 4 now. Okay. So the estrogen goes back to the hypothalamus, goes back to the AP, right? And in number 4 is this: in the presence sorry, can't spell today. In the presence of GnRH, of estrogen rather, more GnRH will be released. from the hypothalamus. Okay. This causes the anterior pituitary gland to release more FSH and LH. Now, this is the second time around, right? The second loop. So this time, the LH is the key one. That is that is dominating. Okay. So that's what's happening here. The next part is number 5. Okay, number 5. The sudden increase in LH, we call it the LH surge, triggers ovulation to occur. Okay. Now, you probably heard me talk about this in the lecture. The LH surge, you will see a sudden spike in LH in your bloodstream, and ovulation kit detects the level of LH in urine. Okay. So you will take a sample of your urine every day on using the device, and using simple antibodies, it will detect the amount of LH in your urine, and it will compare it to the previous day. And if there's a sudden increase, drastic increase in the level, then it would tell you that you're ovulating today. So it will be useful information for planning around pregnancy, right? So that's what number 5 is. Okay. All right, I'm going to go back and copy the other half. All right, so that was ovulation. After ovulation, the remaining material is going to become the corpus luteum, right? Corpus luteum. Okay, so that's number 6 here. We're trying to describe. So after ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed. And it releases progesterone. All right, so right now the egg is already in the fallopian tube, right? It's potentially might get fertilized, so there is no need to have another egg. There's no need to develop another egg. So what progesterone does is gonna do negative feedback as opposed to positive feedback for estrogen. It's gonna go back and inhibit the release of GnRH, as well as inhibit the release of FSH and LH, right? Because we don't want to have another follicle developing. We don't need to trigger another ovulation, okay? So 2 effects of progesterone. Okay, number 1, it will inhibit the release of GnRH, FSH, and LH through negative feedback. And number 2, it will further thicken the endometrium in preparation for a potential pregnancy. Okay, because now the egg is in the fallopian tube. Fertilization, if it's going to happen, is going to happen anytime now. Okay, so it will further develop the blood vessels, further thicken the endometrium, just in case fertilization occurs. Then you have to be ready for the implantation. Okay, so that would be number 6. Okay, and the inhibition of GnRH will cause FSH to lower as well. So that would be number 7 here. Okay. So what happens? 2 things can happen. If pregnancy does not occur, then the corpus luteum will break down. Okay. So here's a couple things to think about. Without the corpus luteum, okay, you will have decrease in progesterone, right? Because the corpus luteum is the structure that is responsible for making the progesterone. With the corpus luteum gone, you would have decrease in progesterone. And the progesterone is the hormone that is supporting the thickness, the blood vessels in the endometrium, right? So if progesterone is low, then you will have the shedding of blood vessels in the endometrium. Okay, and that results in the menses, right? Secondly, when you have decrease in progesterone, means negative feedback is no longer there, right? And without the negative feedback, you will have increase in GnRH, and the next cycle begins. Okay, so that's what happens when there's no pregnancy. Right? You shed the endometrium, and then you start the next cycle again. Okay, what happens if there is pregnancy? Okay, if pregnancy occurs, the developing placenta secretes HCG. Okay, human chorionic gonadotropin, which is called HCG, which sustain the corpus luteum and therefore maintain the progesterone level, right? More than ever, it's important to maintain the high level of progesterone if there is a pregnancy, because then that means you're gonna have the implantation, right? The zygote, the embryo is gonna implant, and it's gonna turn into the fetus, right? So we cannot let the blood vessels shed, and that's what the progesterone is going to to be doing. Okay, but you know, the corpus luteum is naturally going to break down, so we need to make sure that it does not do that, and that's where HCG comes in. And so to test if you're pregnant or not, the pregnancy kit actually tests for HCG. Okay, so pregnancy kit. Okay, once the placenta is fully formed, though, the placenta will take over and produce the estrogen and the progesterone, which would mean that you no longer need the corpus luteum. All right. So that's a lot of stuff going on here. But once again, does anybody have any question at all about any of these? Okay. All right, let's put it in a flow chart and a diagram and see if it makes sense. So at the beginning, we have the hypothalamus once again. And the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. Okay, so in the first half of the cycle, the GnRH is going to secrete the FSH, right? FSH. And again, there is a little bit of LH as well, but not so significant at this point. FSH is going to go and basically go to the ovary and cause the follicle to develop, and that will lead to increase in estrogen. As the follicle develops, it's going to release the estrogen. Estrogen will go back to the hypothalamus and further encourage more GnRH to be produced. At the same time, the estrogen will thickens the endometrium. Okay. Second time around, the GnRH is going to do this again, FSH, and more LH in this case. Okay, increase. The LH will trigger ovulation, right? The LH surge. And after ovulation, because of the formation of the corpus luteum, you will have increase in progesterone. Progesterone will also thicken the endometrium, but more importantly, it will go back, but this time have negative feedback, and it will shut down the release of GnRH, and therefore lowers the FSH and the LH as a result. Okay, so that's like a summary in flowchart form. Okay. All right, let's do some poll questions, see how much you remember. Launch a poll. Go ahead. Let's try the first one. Yeah, very straightforward. All of you got it right. Very good. Try the next one here. Go ahead. Okay. The endometrium will thicken in the presence of progesterone and estrogen. Okay. We don't think about it too far back. Okay, some of you might be thinking, well, if you have FSH, then that will lead to increase in estrogen, which would then lead to the thickening of the endometrium, right? We only think about it in terms of like one step back. Otherwise, if you keep on tracing it backwards, then it becomes very complicated, right? So the correct answer is just the estrogen and the progesterone. Okay. Hey, how about this one? Let's see. Okay. If you increase progesterone will go back to the hypothalamus and have negative feedback. It will suppress the hypothalamus. If you suppress the hypothalamus, you will have decrease in GnRH. Okay, it will also suppress the anterior pituitary glands, causing FSH and LH to decrease. So the correct answer is B and C. Okay, you are not gonna have HCG. That's just for, you know, if you become pregnant. Okay, what about number 4 right here? Go ahead. Interesting. I think some of you are confusing between question 4 and question 5. Okay, ovulation, kid, detects LH. Pregnancy, kid, detects HCG. Okay, remember the LH surge, that's the one that will trigger the ovulation, right? That's the one that will trigger the release of the egg. And pregnancy is detecting HCG, which is released by the developing placenta, right? Okay, so make sure you don't confuse these two on the test. These are for men stuff. Okay, so we're gonna go back to our notes here. This diagram I explained in the videos already, but you know, I can quickly go through it again. Okay, so a couple of things here. There are 4 graphs. The first graph here is the LH. And this graph here is the FSH. This one is estrogen. This one is progesterone. Okay, so let's see what happens, right? At the beginning, right, during the first half. What do we call the first half again? Just double checking. Do you remember what it's called? What phase is that?
Follicular phase.
That's the follicular phase. Thank you. All right, and I hope the rest of you also remember that's the follicular phase. And as the follicle develops, you can see how the estrogen is going up, right? Estrogen is going up. What is this estrogen doing? This estrogen is going back up to the brain and causes more GnRH to be released. Right, so more GnRH will result in more LH and more FSH, right? So you can see the peak in the estrogen is followed by a peak in LH and FSH. Right? This sudden sharp increase is called the LH surge. And again, that's the hormone that is being detected in ovulation kid. Once the LH surges, the egg will be released into the fallopian tube, and the follicle is no more after that point, right? That's why you see a drop in estrogen here. Okay. After ovulation, estrogen is just going to go down because the follicle is no longer there. But the follicle, after releasing the egg, becomes the corpus luteum. And as the corpus luteum forms, you will be pumping out progesterone. Now, you might remember progesterone goes back to the brain and lowers GnRH, right? Which in turn lowers the FSH and lowers the LH. Okay, so this sudden drop in LH, decline in LH and FSH is caused by increase in progesterone. Okay, but progesterone doesn't stay high for very long because the corpus luteum will break down. And as corpus luteum breaks down, you will have a drop in progesterone. Okay, so all this stuff happens in the luteal phase. Okay, and here you can see the corpus luteum. When it's fully formed, that's when you have the peak in the progesterone. And the thickness of the endometrium, which is what this picture is showing, the thickness of the endometrium is directly related to how much estrogen and progesterone you have. Right? At the peak of the progesterone level, that's when you have the thickest endometrium. But if there's no pregnancy, corpus luteum breaks down, progesterone drops, and then the menses begin. Okay? That is that. So for men, it's very similar, I would say. Much simpler though, I mean. But in terms of the hormone that are involved, it's quite similar. Okay, so for male, we again start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will secrete the GnRH. Both men and women have GnRH. That would act on the anterior pituitary gland to release LH and FSH. Okay, the equivalent of a follicle in male are basically instead of developing a follicle to form an egg, will be developing to form sperms, right? So the FSH is going to act on these cells called the Sertoli cells, right? Which would support and facilitate spermatogenesis. Okay. Now, if you think back to the female version, the LH will lead to increase in progesterone, right? Okay, but men, instead of having progesterone, what's the analog to that? What's the male version of that, huh? Yeah, the testosterone. Okay, so the testosterone producing cells will be stimulated by the LH, which would then secrete testosterone. Okay. Now, very similar to the female situation, there is also positive and negative feedback. The testosterone will help reinforce this spermatogenesis. But if you're already producing quite a bit of sperm, then maybe you can slow down its production. So it's going to go back and negatively inhibit the GnRH production. Okay. In fact, there is another hormone secreted by these cells that would also go back and do the inhibition. It is called the inhibin. Okay. So the key idea is to understand there must be a balance between the positive feedback and the negative feedback so that you don't waste resources making things that you already have, right? Okay. So that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of, all the pathways. And let's go back to the study guide here. This we already discussed. There is a video on this. You should definitely watch it. It's one of the most viewed videos that I've created. It was like 4,000 something views or something, which is weird. And over here, this is the hormone chart. I filled this in already in the lecture recordings. Definitely go look that up. And oh, okay, let's fill this thing up together. Forgot to erase from last class. Okay. So the uterine lining, right? That's the lining of the uterus, basically. That is the endometrium. Okay. Endometrium, which again, the thickness is related to how much estrogen and progesterone you have. The tube that connects, sorry, not collects, connects with the ovaries to the uterus, that would be the fallopian tube. Also known as the oviduct. Oviduct. The muscle of the uterus is smooth muscle, which means we don't have voluntary control over. That is called the myometrium. The lowest portion of the uterus is called the cervix. Okay, when there is pregnancy, there's a mucus plug that forms at the cervix that keeps anything from going in, anything that's from coming out. Because we don't want, like, pathogens to go into the womb, for example, to affect the baby, right? Something is a hormone secreted from the hypothalamus. That would be the GnRH. It regulates the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. The corpus luteum is a transient structure in the uterus and secretes the hormone progesterone. A surge, like sudden increase of LH, triggers ovulation. And then the HCG is a hormone produced by the developing placenta. The process of sperm production is spermatogenesis, which would be encouraged by the presence of FSH. There are 3 major glands in the male reproductive system that contributes to the formation of semen. That includes the prostate, which gives it nutrients. It includes the seminal vesicle. Seminal vesicle, which helps modulate the pH. And there is also the bulbal urethral gland, which flushes the urethra before the ejaculation. All right, let's take a look at this situation here. Application question. Theon is upset about his low sperm count and decides to buy testosterone supplements online. He took twice the recommended dose. The supplements increases his libido and made him feel more masculine. After taking the supplements for a few months, he went to his doctor to do another sperm count. How do you think the sperm count results will be? Justify your answer using proper physiological terminologies and concepts. So what do you think? Do you think he's going to have normal sperm count, high sperm count, or even lower sperm count than before? What do you think? And why? Right, that's probably more important. Okay. Let's do a vote. Let's see what you guys think, huh? Let's do a vote. All right. So if you think he's gonna have like normal, okay, number 2, same as before, or like even lower. Okay, we say higher than before. He take the supplement same as before or lower. What do you guys think? What's going on with Theon? Ooh, we have a 3-way split here with the results. Interesting. Okay, well, let's go back to what we wrote down here, right? See, testosterone is going to help support spermatogenesis, but if you have too much testosterone, then it's actually going to go back and inhibit the GnRH, right? And without the GnRH, you are not going to have the FSH, and that actually will negatively impact the spermatogenesis. Okay, it's the same thing as female. If people take progesterone as a I don't want to say supplement, okay, but if a person takes progesterone, let me rephrase the question. When would a person want to take progesterone? If they're trying to get pregnant or if they're trying to not get pregnant? What do you think? Yeah, to not get pregnant, right? Because if you take progesterone, you're actually going to go back and inhibit the release of GnRH, FSH, and LH and prevent ovulation from happening, right? So it's the same kind of logic. If you have too much testosterone, right, you're just going to end up inhibiting the spermatogenesis production process. And so the correct answer over here is he probably going to have lower than before sperm count. Okay, same or lower, I would say. Okay, definitely not higher. Okay, more likely to be lower because of the negative feedback inhibition. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this next question here. So there is this drug. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but I'll give it a try anyways. Is Novonorgestrel. Okay, it's a synthetic progesterone sold under the brand name Plan B. It is commonly known as the morning after pill, which prevents pregnancy after unprotected sex. Statistically, an estimated 0.6 to 2.6% of women who take the morning after pill after unprotected sex will still get pregnant. On the product's website, it explains that this is not an abortion pill. Based on your knowledge of female reproductive system, explain how the drug cannot prevent pregnancy 100% and why taking it will not cause an abortion if you're already pregnant when you take the pill. Yeah, Gorinda for the first one. Yeah, low sperm count. That would be the choice. Yeah. So what do you think? Huh? How come this pill is not 100% if it's a synthetic progesterone? Okay. And you know, if you're pregnant and you take this, why wouldn't it cause an abortion? Okay, so just think about that for a moment, right? If anybody want to try to explain, I certainly welcome that. If not, that's okay as well. I will explain in a second. Okay, so progesterone will lead to decreased GnRH, which leads to decrease in FSH and LH, right? So low LH equals no ovulation. Okay, so that's the number one thing you want to interfere if you're trying to not get pregnant, right? Okay, so the sperm can, once it enters the female's body, can stay there for like, up to 4 or 5 days. Okay, and in extreme cases, it could be there for like almost a week. Okay, so you want to make sure, if a person has unprotected sex, they want to make sure that there is no egg. Right? With the sperm inside the body now, you want to make sure that there's no egg anywhere in the fallopian tube, right? And so if you take this synthetic progesterone the morning after, that prevents ovulation from happening if it hasn't already happened. Okay, but if ovulation already occurred when the person had the unprotected sex, taking this product, this medication, will not reverse the process. The egg is already in the fallopian tube, right? You cannot prevent something from happening if it already happened, right? So that's why even if you take it, if you already ovulated, there's still a chance that you might get pregnant. Okay, so it's not 100% guarantee. Now, it's not an abortion because, once again, if you already have the egg in your system, taking this medication will have zero effect on the fate of the egg. Right? If the egg is meant to be fertilized, then it will be fertilized. You're not going to be interfering with that process. Okay, the medication is to interfere with the release of the egg. Okay, it's not going to do anything to the egg once it is released. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Okay, next one.
Professor,
Yeah,
Professor,
please go ahead, Mohammed.
in that case, she need to like take an abortion pill. Am I right? Because it's already formed. That egg is already formed. So if she want to like prevent that, she need to take that abortion pill. Am I right?
Theoretically, yes. I mean, like that would be extreme situation, I would say, in the sense that if someone had unprotected sex, they wouldn't automatically go and take an abortion pill, right? Like that's just like, skipping a few steps in between, right? Number one, just because someone has unprotected sex, it doesn't necessarily mean there is going to be a pregnancy, right? Okay, so if the person chooses to go down that route, it would be after they've confirmed that they're actually pregnant. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right, number 3, clomiphene citrate is used to induce ovulation in some forms of infertility. Its function is similar to GnRH. Explain how clomiphene can induce ovulation. Well, it's the opposite of what we are trying to discuss in number 2, right? If it functions like GnRH, then taking the clomiphene will increase the amount of FSH and LH in the body, right? So if you increase the amount of FSH, then you will increase the amount of follicles that might be developing. So instead of having one follicle develop in one ovary, maybe now you would have both ovaries developing an egg, right? And increase in LH would also trigger the ovulation for both of them, which is why the people who take clomiphene will increase the chance of having twins by about 10%, because now you don't just have one egg in the system, you're going to have more than one egg. Now, of course, these would be non-identical twins because they come from separate eggs, but nevertheless, you would increase the chance of having a twin pregnancy. Okay. All right, last one. In an experiment, rat ovaries were removed immediately after impregnation, and then the rats were divided into 2 groups. Treatments and results are summarized in the table below. Propose an explanation for the result and write a conclusion for the experiment. So over here we have group 1, and for the group 1, they will receive daily injections of 0.25 milligram of progesterone. And none of them is able to carry the fetus to birth. Whereas if you give them 2.0 milligram of progesterone every day, then all of the rats are able to carry the fetus to birth. I mean, this is expected result, right? Because the ovary is the source of the progesterone. while we wait for the placenta to fully develop, right? Okay, because you still need the corpus luteum to produce the progesterone, right? While you wait for the placenta to form. So if you remove the ovaries, then you don't have the source of progesterone, which means the endometrium is going to shed, and that cannot support the fetal growth, right? So that's why you need to give them progesterone. Over here in group 1, right? Like, I mean, they're giving the rats a little bit of progesterone, but clearly 0.25 milligram, it's not enough, right? So there must be some minimal dose that's required to sustain the pregnancy. Okay. All these diagrams are labeled in the lecture recording, so I'm not going to redo that again. And that's it for today, okay? So we only have one more lesson, which we will do next Thursday, the hormones, and then we will have a review for test 3 in the following week. I will also post the answer for lab number 3, so that after you've done it, you can look at the answers yourself. And I'll post an announcement to let you know when the lab 3 is going to be due. Now this one is a little bit longer. It's worth 5% of your final grade instead of 2.5. Because in addition to all the stuff that we are learning in this unit, lecture 9 to 12, there are also microscope slide questions for the entire course. Right, so what you want to do is you want to go back to the earlier lab PowerPoint and take out the slides related to microscopy. Okay, so like we look at slides of like blood smear, we look at slides of the intestinal tract. So you want to have those slides beside you when you do the quiz. That way, you will have something to quickly look up if you're stuck on a question. Okay. So yeah, you're almost there. Okay, 2 more weeks to go. I'm sure you will do just fine. Other than that, Victoria has a question. Where can we get the answers for question number 3 again? Which question number 3? Like this one that I just talked about over here? The chart. Oh yeah, it's in the lecture recording. Every week the record, like part 1 of 3, part 2 of 3, those things. You know what I'm talking about? The YouTube one. Yeah, those. Okay. So, I mean, if you can't find it, just send me an email and I will send you the link personally. Okay. All right. Thanks again, guys. Have a good week. I'll see you next Thursday. Bye for now.